Sin is a tricky thing. Like I said, a lot of times I don't really want to think much about it, but sin is a deceitful liar. And man, it always has been and it always will be. The problem with sin, one, we don't want to recognize it, but two, we convince ourselves it's not really that big of an issue in that sometimes we can handle it. Just a little bit, we say, won't be too bad. I just need to investigate, do a little research, see what it's like. And we get ourselves in trouble, and it just draws us in. And there's this old quote I heard years ago. I don't remember where it come from or where it came from or who said it, but it had an impact on me, so I'll share it today. It says, sin will take you further than you want to go. It'll keep you longer than you want to stay, and it'll cost you more than you want to pay. So let me say it again. Sin will take you farther than you want to go. It'll keep you longer than you want to stay, and it'll cost you more than you want to pay. Or to quote the Eagles, you can check out, but you can never leave. People are like, I've taken vacations like that. I know what that's about. Oh, that's sin. No, it just does. It just is deceitful that way. It gets in like our call to worship we read this morning. There's this pattern that just slowly draws us in. And to talk about sin can be a little awkward, and it can be like, whoa. And this is not about shame, though. This is not about me, Pastor Kyle, pointing my finger at you because I'm better than you or anything like that. It's just about God revealing something to us and saying, like Brittany talked about earlier, there is a freedom that's offered to us. Like that's what we get in Christ, is freedom from sin. Galatians 5:1 says that. It's freedom from, it's a different path forward. And now why that's important is because that's what we see today. That's a principle, a big underlying principle that we see today in Sodom and Gomorrah, is this option out. This different way, and then our tendency to struggle with that different way, with trusting God enough to listen and follow Him, right? And because that's hard. And so when I talk about sin this morning, just so we're all on the same page, like what's our starting reference point? I want to make sure that we're at least starting from the same place. So sin, simply and broadly defined, is any action, any thought, or any attitude that falls short of God's standard of morality. So there's this baseline of how we should treat one another. Now, Jesus actually clarified a lot of this because He didn't just say action. It's not just something that I do. Jesus said, look, He said, you've heard the law talk about adultery and that, you can't cheat on your spouse. He said, look, if you even look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery already, if you're a married person. So he really gets to the heart of the issue. It's not just what you do, it's where it starts first and how you're thinking and what you're doing. So Jesus' level of basic morality is really, it's a high bar, right, of right and wrong. And so this is what I'm talking about. So now, to maybe flesh that out a little bit, what did that look like in the Old Testament? So before Jesus shows up on earth, what is the morality of the Old Testament in the law? What are the things that we see? 10 Commandments flesh out a lot of these. Idolatry was a big one, right? Don't worship things other than God, right? He's the only one worthy of our worship. Adultery, as I mentioned. Murder. Jesus says it's not just murder, though. If you hate your brother, anger can even be like murder, he says. So, again, he's kind of ratcheting things up. Theft. Again, you're stealing time from work. Envy. Lying. Blasphemy, right? Disrespecting God. Oppression of the poor, huge in the Old Testament. Injustice, huge in the Old Testament. And pride. Pride's a big one that gets a lot of us in trouble. So that's a sampling, right, of just a very, very small sampling. In the New Testament, what are some themes that we see because of Jesus and after Jesus? Pride, again, greed. We see lust and anger and overindulgence, whether it's food or alcohol. We see envy and even laziness. Actually, in the Old Testament, you see a lot about laziness. Deceit, hypocrisy, unforgiveness, right? So, like, how do these wear on us? Which ones, I should say, are big. When I first came on staff as a pastor here, Pastor Dean, who is currently the pastor at that time, he said, Kyle, do you know your top 3 sins? I was like, never really thought about it. And, I was like, I'm not dumb, so I know which ones kind of, and he just comes like, I know. He said, listen, the reason I'm asking you that is he said, if you don't know, not in a shameful way, but if you don't know your 3 big struggle areas, he said, those are going to be the ones that get you in trouble, right? So if it's pride, or if it's arrogance, or being judgmental, or if it's gossip, or if it's lust, or if it's, he's like, those are going to be the things that are always nailing you and are always getting you in trouble. And I was like, And he said, and as a pastor, you cannot afford to let those 3 get the better of you. None of us can, but particularly as a pastor, because the bar is quite a bit higher, if you didn't know, for me than it is for people that come to church. And I take that pretty seriously, right? So he was trying to get me to understand this principle, like take sin seriously, not in a shameful way, but in a way that's like, okay, I've got a better path. I got a better way. So since that's all the setup for today, but since we're in part 4 of Genesis, it's wrestling with reality. It's wrestling with like, okay, this is what I know to be true right now. This is the world I live in. Lot and his family in Sodom is where we're going to be. And here's the call out, right? So the issue is, will I trust God with the unknown? When that happens, that's over and over and over again in part 4 of Genesis here. You're going to see this come up again. So they're going to have to leave and not know if that's actually better. So God, this is the world I live in. This is my culture, and what my culture says is okay and good, and I'm making a pretty good living here. I'm influential here, and you want me to do this totally different thing and walk away from that and be a different person. Abraham had to do it last week. Lot's going to have his opportunity with his family to do it this week as we look at Sodom and Gomorrah. And the point, the purpose, what you see out of this in Genesis 19 is don't let sin destroy you. Because that's really what's on the table. It's like a heavier message today because of what happens in Genesis chapter 19. So let's just jump in then. So we got the setting here for us. So 2 angels enter Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in Sodom's gateway. So there's a lot that's important here. So you have these two angels that come in. So it's like at the very nature of what's happening, there's the supernatural, right? They come in, they're foreigners, they don't live there. You have Lot, who's sitting there, also a foreigner. It's nighttime. So nighttime is an important setting note as well for what's about to happen. Now, since he's sitting in Sodom's gateway, this is a path. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I remember a preacher years ago when early on in my Christian journey, he said to me, and he was preaching in this passage, and he said, what happens to Lot in Genesis chapter 19 is important for all of us to pay attention to. He said, because Lot, his journey with Sodom, and Sodom is notoriously an evil place, and you're going to see some of those themes this morning. But this preacher, I don't even remember who it was, but he said, Lot sets his tent up outside the city. In Genesis chapter 13. We're in Genesis chapter 19 today. But if you go back to Genesis chapter 13, verses 12 and 13, this is actually where his journey with Sodom began. So Abraham, he lives in the land of Canaan. So it's like south or like northwest of where Lot lives. But Lot lived down in the cities on the plain, down in this valley, and he set up his tent near Sodom. And I remember this preacher saying, like, we do that with sin. We know something's not good for us, and yet we get as close as we can to it. And we just say, well, Lord, it's not that bad. It's just, and we make whatever excuses we want. And he said, but then we forget what we're setting our tent up next to. And that's verse 13. He says, now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. So if we go back to our passage, Genesis 19, so 2 angels enter, and there's Lot sitting at the Sodom's gateway. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you sit at the gateway of a city back then, 4,000 years ago, that meant you were a person of influence. In that culture, a man of influence. And so that means he went from living outside the city to now being totally ingratiated with this culture, totally integrated with this culture. And not just like integrated, but now he's become a person of influence, apparently, to be able to sit here. Because this is where legal matters were taken care of and business matters were taken care of in the ancient world. And even still some places today in the Middle East. So he is now completely integrated with this culture. So again, how close do we want to get? And then the next couple verses, what happens is they come in, Lot sees them, runs out, bows down to them, and he says, hey, come to my house and I'm going to fix you dinner. They say, no, we want to sleep out in the city square. Now that's a weird rejection of hospitality, right? Because they say, no, we'd rather sleep out in the city. And that'd be the same for you guys today. Like, not many of us are going to be like, I'm going to go to Boston, and instead of getting an Airbnb, I'm just going to go ahead and sleep downtown, right? Like, most of us aren't going to do that. It's safer to sleep with somebody. So they don't want to be there, which is odd. They know who Lot is. They know in part that's why they're there for this dude. And they're like, nah, hard pass. I don't want to stay with you. So then they come in, and then the unexpected happens. A huge turn in the story, a huge shift. So before they went to bed, the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, the whole population, so this is some hyperbole here, surrounded the house. They called out to Lot and said, where are the men who came with you tonight? Send them out to us so that we may have sex with them. So if you weren't aware or weren't sure, this is where sodomy comes from, right? This is where the word sodomy comes from. So like I said, there's some hyperbole here. What they're saying when they say young and old and the whole population, probably there's about 8,000 people that live here. So that means about maybe 4,000 of them are men. That doesn't mean literally that 4,000 men are trying to bang down the door at Lot's house. What it means is that this culture is completely saturated, young and old, the entire population. It's pervasive. Sexual sin and evil are pervasive. So a lot of people are like, oh yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, that's sodomy, that was homosexuality, that was a sin. No, and part of it, but that's not what's going on here really. Because think about what they're saying. They want to come and they want to take these two men and they want to rape them. Like, that's the environment that we're talking about here. So when God says last Sunday in Genesis 18, I'm going to go down, Abraham, and I'm going to check it out. I won't just arbitrarily destroy the city. I'll go and check it out for you. But not that he doesn't know, but he's letting Abraham, like, okay, I'm going to do this so you can see me. So he goes down, and this is the answer that he gets. This is the culture. This is the world that Lot is living in. So it's not just one issue. It's the treatment of these foreigners, because that's a big deal for Old Testament Mosaic law. Like, that's a huge thing, is how we treat foreigners and aliens that live amongst us. And so they're doing that, and then the whole rape thing. But then in Ezekiel 16, I shared last Sunday. So if you weren't here or don't remember, this passage is about 1,500 years after the events of Sodom and Gomorrah. What Ezekiel says, their sin, verse 49, was the oppression of the poor. Injustice. Verse 50 says they committed detestable acts. Now, what is a detestable act? Sometimes it's sexual sin. Other times it's just like false worship, or it's just evil things. It can be a lot of different things. So it's not just a sexual sin issue here. There was just rampant evil in this place. And for 1,500 years, they were still being used as the model, right? So this place had a terrible, terrible, terrible reputation. So what does Lot do? Verse 6, he goes out to them, the entrance of the door, and he shuts the door behind him. So it's actually a pretty brave thing. And he said, don't do this evil, my brothers. So this is like his soul redeeming act here, because you have all these issues that are going on. But then after this, though, he does something that is unfathomable for me today, and probably for you as well. So this is what Lot says to this group of men, both young and old. He says, look, I've got 2 daughters who haven't been intimate with a man. I've got 2 virgin daughters. And it's like, what was happening in that moment right there? And he says to them, I'll bring them out to you, and you can do whatever you want to them. However, don't do anything to these men, because they've come under the protection of my roof. So when we look at people in the Bible, don't ever assume that what they do is the model for us. That's a huge mistake, to assume or think that people are in the Bible because there's some kind of like moral pillar for us to look at. They're there because there's something to learn, certainly. So there is a cultural thing happening here. I'll say this first. There is a cultural thing happening here that if somebody comes under your roof, you do protect them no matter what. If you ever heard the story recently from Afghanistan, lone survivor, right? You have a Navy SEAL that gets caught behind enemy lines in Afghanistan, and he is literally kept alive by a man that is living out this principle that's still very alive and well in that part of the world. So he knows this is an enemy soldier, but because of this, he's honor bound to this principle right here. He protects this guy. It's an American Navy SEAL protects him. So very much still a real thing, but this is just being taken to the absolute extreme. This is the result if I live in like a morally putrid place, and like I started off saying, I'm now in a position, Lot would have to think, I'm now in a position where sin has cost me more than I can pay. Because what do? I'm honor bound to protect these 2 men, and I'm going to offer my daughters? Are you kidding me? Like, if anybody ever comes knocking on my house and you're a guest at my house, I'm not going to give up Asher for you. I love you a lot. But don't ever look at me and be like, me? No, I'm like, no, get out. No, I'd fight for you, don't worry, but you're not getting my daughter. So this is what happens, right? And it's just like, it's unfathomable that would happen. So, but this is the environment that he's living in. This is the impossible situations that now he's finding himself in. Sin has really begun to cost and take more than he wants. So, verse 9, they say to them, get out of the way. This one came here as an alien. So there's that theme again, right? The foreigner, the alien. How do we treat foreigners? Here is this alien, but he's acting like a judge. Well, so no respect for this guy that clearly kind of was a judge. Now we'll do more harm to you than to them. And when I read this week, and I thought about this kind of over the weekend and even today, I tried to make it personal for myself. I said, self, what's a time where you did this, where you wanted to so badly to get in with the right crowd or the right influential person, and you sacrificed what you knew was right? And that hits pretty close to home for most of us. Like, when do you sacrifice in relationships something that you know is right, and you're like, well, I just kind of have to do this now? And then I want you to think, well, how did you feel when you did that? Because I know for me, it left me feeling awful, right? If I knew this was wrong and I just kind of went along with it, right? In the past, I've laughed at things I shouldn't have, right? I've done things I definitely shouldn't have. I've sacrificed a lot in my past, and it was all part of my journey, but it's like, man, this guy right here did everything he could to get into a seat of influence, and now they're going to do more harm to you, Lot, than they are to them. Like, he sacrificed everything for this group of people, and this is how they treated him. So then they put pressure, it says, on Lot, which means literally now they're crowding in, they're crashing the front door, and they're going to try to break this down, take Lot, take his people, probably take the daughters. But the angels, now we have the supernatural, the angels reach out and they brought Lot into the house with them, and they shut the door. They struck the men who were at the entrance to the house, both young and old, with blindness, so that they were unable to find the entrance. Then the angel said to Lot, look, do you have anyone else here, a son-in-law, your sons, daughters, anyone else in the city who belongs to you? So, right, they're like, okay, is there the 10? Is there actually 10 people here? God said he'd save the place for 10 people. That's what we read last Sunday. But are there actually 10 people that are here? Can we find them? And angels don't know everything. This is kind of like an insight that angels aren't all knowing, right? They don't really know, do you have sons-in-laws, daughters, sons? What's going on here? And they said, get them out of this place. For we're about to destroy this place because of the outcry, just because of the level of toxicity and evil and sin against its people. It's so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. It's like the angels are like, okay, we've seen enough. We came down here to investigate. Didn't take us long to find out. Is God merciful? Yes. What's hard for us as humans, and even me as your pastor, is when I see God's justice and then the outworking of his mercy and his justice, right? Because here's what I get from people. Why does God keep letting them get away with this? They're struggling with God's grace. Then on the other hand, they'll say, why was God so harsh? Why didn't he give them more time? They're struggling with God's justice. So God's grace and mercy are really hard sometimes to fit together. Like, why is he waiting so long? Why was he so quick? And so in this story here, you're seeing his grace, mercy, and justice all work at the same time. And it's a painful story because he is willing to be patient and graceful because this was their last chance. I'm going to go down and check it out and see if it's that bad. And this is the response. So his grace and his mercy are tough things to understand. So here's what Lot does. He goes out, verse 14, to speak to his sons-in-law. He's got 2 of them who were to marry his daughters. Get up, he said, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. Right. God's going to destroy the city. I'm sure. Right? Same today, right? That's a ridiculous claim. And they're like, yeah, I bet. We'll see. But the harsh reality is this: in this moment, they're doing the same thing as the city. And this is instructive for us today. They're choosing God's justice instead of God's mercy. Jesus is going to use this whole scene when he's here on earth in Luke 17 as a way to instruct us about eternity. He says, look, just like the people of Noah and the flood, just like Lot and the Sodomites and everything that was going on in those 2 different stories of God's judgment, they were just living their lives thinking that God's judgment was a joke, and then all of a sudden God's judgment came. Jesus says, one day when I come back, my judgment's going to be the same way. And he makes it an eternal issue. And he says there is a heaven and hell. There is a judgment that's going to come. And it's like the weight of what Jesus says is like, ouch. Because this is a heavy story. And for Jesus 2,000 years later to be talking about it in light of eternity is something that is worth paying attention to. So then here we go. God's patience again. At daybreak. So they showed up in the evening, and for some reason he has still not left. Lot has still not pulled himself away from the cities. So the angels have to urge Lot on, get up, Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. It's like, Lot, hey man, it's decision time. Again, I personalize this. Self. When God offers you a way out, do you take it? Or do I just keep pushing on in my sin? If Brittany and I get into an argument and my pride starts to, don't back down. And Brittany knows I hate it because she knows the face. She knows the environment. I put out a smell or something. I don't know what it is. She knows Kyle's about to get prideful and just be stubborn and dumb. And then I do. And then I have to make the choice. God's offered me a way out by saying, actually, I'm sorry. That was a little harsh. Am I going to take it? 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, look, the temptations that you face, they're not uncommon to man, right? Everybody faces temptation. Everybody faces sin. The question is, and it says, are you going to take the way that, two things. God's going to give you the strength to stand up under it, and he's going to give you a way out. The question is, will we take them, right? Both in this life and for the next. And so these are the things. What are we going to do? Here's what Lot did, verse 16. He hesitated. Given a way out, he knew the evil of this place clearly, but he loved the life of Sodom. So because the Lord's compassion for this guy, Lot, and for Abraham, the men grabbed his hand and his wife's hand and the hand of his 2 daughters, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. They literally had to drag him away from sin and destruction. Make that personal. How often do we have to be dragged away from sin and destruction? And God's just like, let's go. Let's go, right? And sometimes, here's what I hear. Again, let's make it personal and real. Just kind of keep on the job theme. I've had people say to me, I don't understand why God would take that job away from me. Then they're gone a week, and they realize what that job was doing to them. Right? So God, in some of those cases, literally had to drag them away from that because the environment there was so toxic, they were becoming toxic. So it's just interesting. Sometimes that's how that happens to us, being dragged away from something like that. As soon as the angels got them outside, one of them said, run for your life. Like, take this seriously, Lot, which they don't. None of them do. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains or you will be swept away. But Lot said to them, no, my lords, please. Your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life. But I can't run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. And I wonder, are they like, hey, dummy, no, this is where you're going to die. Like, we just told you, get out of here. And he's like, no, I can't go up there. So he can't let go. Look, this town, which is called Zoar, is close enough for me to flee to. It's just a small place. Please let me run to it. It's only a small place. It's just a little guy. Don't even worry, but look how cute it is. I can survive there. So here's just like, this is real life patterns. So a way out is offered. Don't do that sin. He hesitates. He has to be drug out. He literally stops them to say no, and now he's haggling, right? He just wants this old way of life so bad that he cannot give it up. Verse 21, and he said to him, the angel said to him, all right, again, the patience and the mercy of God, and then this whole story here. I'll grant your request about this matter too, and will not demolish the town that you mentioned. Verse 22, hurry up, run to it, for I cannot do anything until you get there. And I stopped on this verse because I was reading a commentary on this week, and an idea was presented that I never really thought about. And it's this. The divine timetable for justice and destruction is at least temporarily suspended for the outworking of God's divine grace. I just thought that was a very interesting idea. We can't do anything until you get there. We have to wait for you. And it's like, could you argue that, they had to wait, or maybe that was part of the plan? I don't know. But it's interesting, though. There's this pause of this justice because God's grace is outworking. Again, how do his grace and his justice, mercy, how do they work together? It's hard for us to wrap our heads around sometimes. So then, this delay of time, the sun had risen fully over the land when Lot reached Zoar. So it took him all night, all morning to get out of this city. Why do we hold on to sin so long? Like, why do we just keep, making excuses, like lying to ourselves? Why do we fight it so much? And it's just like, this is his patience, but then eventually the patience runs out. And this is the part of the story where most people are familiar with, if you know the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Verse 24, then out of the sky, which is crazy, right? These things don't come from the sky. The Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, burning sulfur from the Lord. Now, sulfur is a naturally occurring element in nature, right? It's found around volcanoes. Problem is there's no volcanoes around there. So sulfur is a Latin word. A little background here. Sulfur is a Latin word. The Hebrew here is gophrite, which means brimstone or burning stone. So hence fire and brimstone, hence God's judgment. So I have people every now and then say, Kyle, can't you preach more fire and brimstone messages? And what they mean is they want me to tell you you're going to hell. That's what a fire and brimstone message is. Now we can be nuanced a bit about that. And I know what they're saying. Like they want me to make it clear that heaven and hell are real things and that that's what's on the line here. And that's what Jesus' ministry was about. And it's like, yes, that's absolutely true. Jesus Christ said, without me, it's fire and brimstone. He used Sodom and Gomorrah as the model for that. He said, look, I came so that you could have freedom. Just like with Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot, I came to give you a way out of God's justice. I'm here to give you his mercy and his grace. I'm here to give you eternal life. I'm here to give you the best life, literally, the abundant life in this life. Like that was Jesus' message. So it is about this life. It is about the next, but fire and brimstone. Now, this all leads us to this next verse here. Verse 25, he demolished these cities, the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and whatever grew on the ground. That seems so harsh. But there's also like two parts of this. One is the warning. One is the last chances. One is like, okay, is this really going to happen? And then two, if you live in a city that is the kind of place where visitors come and run the risk of being raped, is it merciful for you to just stay in that and live in that, regardless of like what your part is? Because it becomes so pervasive that God was just like, look, this has to completely end. This place is that toxic that this is just going to keep spilling out into the valley. And this environment is going to spread everywhere. So God's like, I'm going to put an end to it. Grace, mercy, and justice. Like these are hard concepts. And in the Bible, when you see, if I mentioned before, in the Bible, when you see God's justice, it's usually after decades and sometimes centuries of God saying, you need to stop this. You need to stop this. You need to stop this. And it just gets so evil. And then you have environments like what we're seeing here in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, there's some, whether you're watching or in the room, you're like, okay, that's cool and all, but like, did that really happen? Or is this like a fairy tale? Like, is there any evidence for this? Or is this just another story from the Bible? Because it seems crazy. Like burning rocks are coming from the sky and volcanoes are nowhere. But I want to introduce you, because it may not be so crazy, I want to introduce you to this place, this site that they found, this city, Tal al-Hammam. It's a Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley. Tal al-Hammam, the Bronze Age is a little bit after Abraham and Lot, rather, but it's pretty close to the time, and it's in the Jordan Valley, which is by the Dead Sea, in the area that this is supposed to have happened. So archaeologists and scientists have dug up a lot of interesting stuff from this site in this part of the world. So what happened at this city? So it's the largest of 3 cities that existed in this area. And of course, we're just named Sodom and Gomorrah, but there could have been more cities. That's not really the point. But it's the largest of 3 cities. There was about 8,000 people that lived in this city. The interesting thing about this city is it was wiped out in the blink of an eye. So there was some kind of an event there that happened that instantly rose the temperature to above 3,600 degrees. And it flash melted everything. So archaeologists and scientists are like, well, how did this happen? No earthly event could have done this because there's nothing around here that could actually have done that. So they're surmising. They're saying, well, maybe this was an exploding comet or an exploding asteroid, and it blew up right before it hit the earth, because clearly fire and brimstone rained down on this place. Scientists are a little unwilling to say this is actually Sodom and Gomorrah, but there's some interesting details, though, that's like, well, maybe it is. So here's some other stuff. So this 3,600 degrees instantly, what did that do? Well, pottery was completely destroyed and melted on the outside, but on the inside was untouched. You see things that were just instantly burned and on fire and toasted. This blast that happened, scientists say, was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that we dropped during World War II, the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It was 1,000 times more powerful than that. And so when that happened, it exploded above the ground and it sent out a shock wave that was about 750 miles per hour. And they can see that because buildings were completely destroyed in an instant and how they were scattered all over the place. Metal was melted all over the city, like flash melted. And then you have this thing called shocked quartz. And shocked quartz they found all over the place. And shocked quartz only happens when there's instant high pressure. When there's things that are like high heat, high pressure, that's when you have this happen. So scientists and archaeologists are like, well, what the heck? Again, what did this? What did this? So they're asking these questions about this site. And then the last thing that's there that's interesting is there's high salt concentrations all over the place. And they think that happened because it's proximity to the Dead Sea, and that when this blast happened, it mixed up all this salt and it got it all over this place, which resulted in this area not being able to be inhabited for centuries because everything was saturated. So nobody lived there, no crops grew, nothing. It was just a wasteland for centuries. And so one scientist that has been there and studied this, he says all the observations stated in Genesis are consistent with a cosmic airburst. That's James Kennett, and he's an earth scientist at the University of California. Now, part of me is like, okay, is this conclusive evidence that this is Sodom and or Gomorrah? No. But it sure is something interesting to think about. Sure is something interesting to think about for me, that this catastrophic event actually happened. And Genesis talks about it happening before they're saying that it actually happened. So you could be like, well, that's just a story they made up, but it's like they're not necessarily, and this isn't like, oh, archaeologically speaking, we know that happened like 1,000 years before the story was ever told. It's not. They're too close for that. So it's just interesting, just something to consider as far as this goes. But what happens next is the hard part. This is the more of the rejecting God's grace. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. So that may be like, all the salt they found all over the place. Was she covered in the blast? Was she like, what was really going on here? We don't 100% know. The thing that we know, because of the Hebrew that this was written in, looked back is nabat. That means to behold, consider, or even depend. So probably what was happening was that she was just unwilling to go. She maybe made her way out because the angels drug her out, but for one reason or another, she just couldn't tear herself away. And again, that's just like, how are you with sin? How are you with these kinds of issues? Am I unwilling to walk away from them? Because that's what happened. And Jesus in Luke 17 in the New Testament, again, uses her as an example. He says, don't forget Lot's wife when we're talking about sin and judgment and these issues that I'm trying to get you to understand. Jesus says, don't forget Lot's wife, because she refused to let go. So then we go back up to the top of the mountain. Now we're out of the valley the next day. Verse 27, early in the morning, the next day, Abraham went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down on Sodom and Gomorrah and all the lands of the plain, and he saw that smoke was going up from the land, like the smoke of a furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle of the upheaval when he demolished the cities where Lot had lived. So the difficulty here, as I see this just repeated rejection of the grace and mercy, is that if God had left him in there, and he had not done this, it would have destroyed not just the area, but it would have destroyed this guy Lot. That's like not a great guy necessarily, right? He's been on some level affected by this. The New Testament said he was still a righteous man, but man, you could see like the lines were getting blurred pretty good for this guy. And so as he walks away, it's really only because God forced him. It's odd to say that God's grace and mercy pulled him out of this, because if God didn't destroy this place, it would have destroyed him. And then as we looked at that verse where we started in James 1, there can be heaviness that comes from these kind of messages, I understand, but this is the freedom that God offers. He says, each person, look, you're tempted by what you're drawn away by, right? That's going to be one and the same. And you're going to be enticed by your own desires. What gets us in trouble? Well, my own desires, right? I've been central to every stupid choice that I've ever made. And you have been central to every stupid choice that you have made, right? Because we make those choices. And then verse 15, he says, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin's fully grown, it gives birth to death. And that's a verse that has been actually very helpful, because when I start going down some path in my mind, I remember the word of James. And I say, yeah, where's this going to go, Kyle? Where is this going to go? And what's it going to cost me? What's it going to cost you? It's a worthwhile exercise to say, what is this going to cost me, both in this life and in the next? Because here's, as I prayed and I thought about this, and what I'll close with, is I want to encourage you. I hope you understand that what God is saying in his word is, go to that last one, PJ, to embrace grace and mercy, not sin and judgment. This is an outworking that they struggled with in this. This is a Jesus kind of idea that he constantly said, I'm here to give you grace and mercy. I'm here to give you an abundant life now and eternal life forever. And this is why he hearkened back to this story in Sodom, because he's like, that's the same thing that they had before them, and then yet they rejected it, and they embraced sin and judgment. Let's go to that last one. Wrestling with reality, right? This is the reality that's set before us. We want to talk about fire and brimstone services. Well, here it is. Choose Jesus, not hell. That's basically what Jesus says, right? Choose Jesus, not this life, not your past life, not sin. Choose Jesus. That's the gospel message. It affects this life and it affects the next. Was that fired up enough? Choose Jesus! Yeah, that's right. All right, let me pray. Lord, I thank you for today, and I thank you, I do, for even the harder messages, and for the harder stories and the harder people and these harder concepts, Lord. I just pray that the Holy Spirit, that you'd show us, God, this stuff is real. It does affect our lives, our everyday lives. Sin does. And Lord, because of you, we've been forgiven, we've been redeemed, and we've had the opportunity to do it differently in this life, but certainly the next, Jesus. Certainly the next, Lord. You came, the sinless one, to be sin for us so that we could have eternity. So I pray again, as we always do, Holy Spirit, would you let this just simmer in whatever way you want to with us, Lord. Whether we need to start relationship with you today, whether we need to come back to you, whether we need whatever. Whatever it is, Jesus Christ, would you do the work? And I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, that's all the positivity I got for today. I love you guys. Have a great week.